Hi, Misha here. This is one I've wanted to do or maybe redo for quite some time. Looking at the British Blackburn Buccaneer. Although, really, most all of these were produced under the Hawker Siddeley name. Buccaneer is what it's known as because that's what it was developed under originally. And I have 3 models here. They're actually pretty similar. They're all 1/72 scale from Corgi. And really telling the difference in Buccaneer variants. S1 to S2, that's easy. But once you get into S2, S2A, S2B, S2C, and S2D, it does get more convoluted and even contradictory, but I will try to address that. So, talk about the history and show a couple of neat features of these here models. So with that, let's just jump right on into it. So all 3 of mine here are RAF. I really would like to have one of the Royal Navy ones, but Corgi has only done 13 models of the Buccaneer, and of those, 10 are RAF. So it's just kind of how it is. It's just kind of how timing is. I actually have the second to first one and the last one they did. I just haven't stumbled across the Navy one. But that's okay. The differences are pretty minor, and most all of these ended up in the RAF anyway. But which is interesting because it very much started off as a Navy fighter. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was introducing a new class of cruiser. It was a light cruiser, fast, capable, and they could mass produce them very easily. And the British, with post-World War II cutbacks, really didn't have the financing to develop ships to counter them. So the idea is, let's just have a strike maritime bomber, 1 bomber per 1 cruiser. Economically, it worked out. And it needed to carry either 1 nuclear weapon or 8,000 pounds in conventional ordnance, be quick, maneuverable at low altitudes, and at least 630 miles per hour, and it would need to be a 2-seater because of naval aviation. These specifications were laid out in 1952-53, and by 54 there were 3 main finalists. And the one we care about is the one from Blackburn, which was the N39 plan, and it was selected in 1955. And the Admiralty really wanted a flight-worthy prototype available by April of 1958. No pressure. And of course, it had all kinds of other strictures so it could operate from carriers with size and whatnot. And to be fair, Blackburn did deliver a prototype that flew on April 30th, 1958. So they made it. Barely. It originally had 2 engines, not these. They were a lower power one. It was a very durable airframe. Had a rotating bomb bay. Again, it could carry up to 4,000-pound bombs on the internal bay or 1 nuke. Originally, it was going to carry a guided nuke called the Green Cheese for some reason, but this was canceled. Again, white paper, budgetary cutbacks, so it would end up carrying the Redbeard bomb like the Canberra, which is just a free-fall tactical nuclear type weapon. It also had up to 4 hard points. Typically, the inboard ones would have these tanks. These are slipper tanks. They're designed to be very aerodynamic, very little drag, and additional pylons could be installed. This up here is a refueling probe. Originally, they tried to have a retractable probe, but it gave problems, so they ended up going with this bolt-on probe design. And they have tandem seating with a pilot in the front, navigator in the back. The nose could fold for being on a carrier, also to get to the radar, which was necessary. The wings could fold. And actually the tail back here could fold. This little thing flashing back here. Anyway, it was designed to take off from a carrier, and with the first prototype in 1958, they continued testing. They actually ordered a large number of pre-production models, like 20, and they did have several accidents early on, but they were really pushing things. Nevertheless, carrier trials began in 1960, and then it was designated as the Buccaneer Strike Mark I, and the first ones were delivered to the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm in 1961, and the first squadron formed in 1962, and the new S-1 would embark on its first full cruise in early 1963. And from there, they would continue to equip. They would quickly have 2 active squadrons on carriers, plus some operating from shore bases. And they would have some conversion training use of these. And it would take over the nuclear role, nuclear strike fighter. But the S-1 was not long for this world. They knew the engines were underpowered, and they weren't stupid. The reason they used them was size and weight constraints. But by the 60s, technology had progressed, and in 1962, the Admiralty ordered an uprated version, and they used a couple of the pre-production models, retrofit them at Blackburn, which had at that time become part of Hawker Siddeley, and the first prototype of what will become the S2 flew in 1963, and unlike the S1, it had a pretty smooth development program without any crashes or injuries, loss of life. Interestingly, 3 were sent over to the USA in 1965 to test them for hot and dry use. And the new engines delivered more thrust, but they were also more fuel efficient. And the Buccaneer was already a pretty fueled up aircraft. We have the 2 external tanks, also a tank B on the internal bay. It had good range. It also had a very strong airframe. Pilots liked how smooth it was. It was a nice handler. Good speed for that day and time for what it was. Top speed was about 660 miles per hour. So it was subsonic, but it only had a max altitude of 40,000 feet. But that wasn't really the point of this aircraft. It was about 64 feet long, 44-foot wingspan. Again, it had to be made within certain constraints. And while they did have several options, for example, early on, it could mount rocket packs, rocket pods. It could also have cluster bombs. They even had a reconnaissance photo thing that could go on the bomb bay. They even had a little cargo crate that could go on the bomb bay. They never had a gun for it. They toured around with the idea of having a gun pack, kind of like the Canberra had, but they never did one for it. When they went to the S2, the new engines, even though they were more powerful, dropped in pretty easily. All they had to do was increase the intakes here a bit to give the engines more air, so they're more ovular shaped to the original S1. They're round. They also reworked the wing a bit. They took the opportunity to give it a better electrical system and a few other updates. But mainly it was the engines. And by October of 65, the S2 was coming into service, so much so that by 66, the S1 was pretty much out by the end of that year. They had built 40 S1s. They had ordered 50, but the last 10, they ended up completing them as S2s. And even though there was talk of retiring Ark Royal and Eagle and other large carriers, the Buccaneer here would go on several cruises throughout 1966, 1967, and the Navy would end up acquiring 84 of the S2s. The S1s, even though they were out of active service, were put ashore for training, conversion work, all that good stuff. However, this would be short-lived. On December 1st, 1970, one S1 coming in to land would have engine failure, basically. And an investigation quickly ruled that the old engines were just worn out and no longer safe And so, the whole S1 fleet was grounded about a week later. Meaning that by 1970, the Navy was operating the S2. What about the Royal Air Force? Well, Blackburn, later Hawker Siddeley, did try selling them on the Buccaneer throughout the 50s and 60s, even making a couple of specialized RAF versions, but they continuously turned it down, saying it was too slow, didn't have what they need. So, yeah, a lot of it was a Navy plane. Originally, they had the TSR-2. That went nowhere and was canceled. And then the Air Force went with the F-111K, the export version of the Aardvark. That was canceled in 1968. That left the Air Force with a need for a jet strike aircraft to replace aging Canberras and a few other aircraft as well, like some of the Hawker Hunters, but namely the Canberras. So, reluctantly in July of 68, the RAF reluctantly ordered aircraft. And this is where the story starts to actually get quite interesting. Now this model here, it's pretty, stripped down and basic. It was, it's in kind of northern winter camo from North Sea operations exercises, which was actually one of the places the Buccaneer was used by both the RAF and Navy quite a bit. Again, it was a maritime strike aircraft, defense aircraft, and, well, with Russian hostilities and all that, that was kind of a key area. The only major export user of the Buccaneer was actually South Africa, who acquired, I think, 16, and they had their own variant, and it was designed for hot and dry environments. Well, let's move on to another one here. Here we have an RAF one. Now, both of these started off, at least according to Corgi, as S2s. This one was updated to be an S.2B. This one seems to be in standard S2 or S.2A configuration. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it doesn't have the optional fueling probe. This one has the slipper tanks. It has the outside pylons installed. I put a couple of little bombs on them just for fun. I don't know, because it could carry pretty much any NATO iron bombs. This model has a couple of neat features. One you might see here is the tail hook for carrier landings. It actually rotates down and then rotates up into the fuselage, like on the real aircraft. But more interesting, the tail opens up like this. That, in military service, was the air brake. Again, for low altitude operations. The model is just kind of neat, and they are keyed together, so if you move one side, it moves together like a clamshell. Looks like a beak. And also, this whole section could fold for carrier storage and being on elevators. I like it when models have articulated parts. Just gives it a little more interest. And of course, these have gear up or down. This is actually the last one they've done, at least so far in the Buccaneer series. It's number 13. And there's actually not a lot out there on this model. Kind of interesting. Anyway, so in the RAF, now the Navy would start retiring a lot of its large carriers. For example, Ark Royal would get refit and go back into service in 1970, but Eagle would not and end up being retired. A couple of its other smaller carriers would be retired too. So by the early 70s, the Navy didn't really need many of these. Now they planned to retire them by early to mid 1970s. As it happened, the Navy would continue operating them until December of 1978, when Ark Royal herself was finally decommissioned. But they had fewer places to use these. So the RAF ended up acquiring, over time, not all at once of course, but 60 of the 84 S2s that the Navy had, especially after Ark Royal retired. And they would order 46 new production ones from Hawker Siddeley. They would do one batch of 26 and a second batch of 20. Yeah, once they got the aircraft, they realized it was actually pretty good and well suited to their needs. Now, they had an updated version. The S2, we talked about a bit. In 1972, they introduced a naming system. Aircraft obtained from the Royal Navy were called 2A. And these had minor modifications for the RAF. They actually retained the tailhook, but they got rid of the catapult cradle stuff on the wings here. They also went to a couple of pieces of RAF avionics. There's a little evidence here. And of course, radios and systems, mostly internal changes. And yeah, that was the 2A. Another thing, the French Martel anti-ship missile was becoming popular, and they wanted some modified to carry these. This was a rocket-powered missile, and the Royal Navy aircraft that could carry them were the S.2B. Now, it wasn't just the Royal Air Force. The Royal Navy was interested as well. Actually, in the end of 1966, they ordered to update some of their S2s to carry the Martel missile, but the whole program in the Navy was slow, almost didn't happen, and the first ones weren't delivered till late 1972, and really they didn't serve, at least in any numbers or strength, until 1975, meaning that the anti-ship missiles in the Navy were only there for about 3 years. Maybe just a hair over. Anyway, Royal Navy aircraft that received a few of the updates from the whole RAF use of the aircraft, these would be designated S2C, but they could not use the Martel missile. The Royal Navy aircraft that could use it were known as S2D. But that's not the end of it. They had a lot of other updates in both the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy. For example, they updated the ejection seats in 1968 to make them true 00 Martin Bakers. Things of that nature. In 1973, the RAF replaced the original rocket pods with updated cluster bombs. And it kind of just would progress from there. But to close out the Navy, yeah, the Martel-capable versions are pretty much the end there. And I do have a ship missile. This is actually from a broken model that came in a big box of parts. It just have a couple of missiles attached to a half-missing Buccaneer. Here's one. As you see, it's quite big. These required special reinforced pylons. They can only really carry 2. Theoretically, they could carry 3. Theoretically, they could carry 4, but the problem with 4 is they couldn't have the targeting pod and carry 4. So 3 was the max, 2 was standard for the Martel missiles. And these were used to fly anti-shipping patrols in mostly the North Atlantic and what have you, and they were actually stationed out of Scotland and became quite popular. So you start to see the aircraft changing a bit and being updated. But after this, the Navy would retire theirs. They were out of service by 1979. The last new production, S2, and it was an S.2B, came out around October of 1977, and of course it went to the RAF. And with that, by 1978, the production line was over. And they built, according to most sources, 211. Again, a few went to South Africa. 3 actually went to the Ministry of Defense for testing, evaluation, for example, at the Royal the Re-Flight Institute there. But the majority, of course, went to the Royal Air Force. And the few that the Navy did not give them were just essentially scrapped or put into museums because they were high-hour airframes. So it would seem as if the Buccaneer, which is a 20-year-old design at this point, was kind of winding down. But actually, in a lot of ways, the best was still yet to come. And now we come to the one that is definitely a S.2B. This left the factory is an S.2B, so it's one of the later production ones. And it's probably my favorite. This is number 2 in the Corgi collection, so it's an older one. And these are nice because they have a full metal stem. This is heavy. It comes with a missile on the wing, and we have a pod here. I assume this is an ECM pod, but it could be a pave spike laser designator pod, because this model is dated 1979, so that is possible. Let me know which one it is, okay, guys? Right there. That's one thing that's a little hard for me, is identifying that stuff. It's hard to ID specifics when you don't see photos. Anywho, in the 70s, the RAF took over maritime patrol duties from the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm using the Buccaneer. They also still were on nuclear patrol. They got rid of the Redbeard and were going to updated parachute nuclear bomb. And actually, the payload has been increasing. The original S1 could only really carry 8,000 pounds, 4,000 under the wings, and 4,000 in the bay. With the S2, this was up to 12,000 pounds, 8,000 in the bay, and then the 4,000 on the wings. And then finally, the RAF introduced a bulge bomb bay door. This could be used to carry even more fuel, or it could be used to carry up to 12,000 pounds in the bomb bay, and kind of give it more flexibility. Pretty impressive payload considering the age and type, and this was meant to be a carrier-based aircraft. I mean, 16,000 pounds total. They did update the ordnance on the wings a bit, at least in theory. I don't know, different changes here and there, but They also really tried to improve the defensive abilities of this aircraft. For example, in 1976, it received ECM pod. It also would soon receive AIM-9 Sidewinder. Usually only just carried one, and early on it was the AIM-9B. Not terribly effective. This is why the whole retarded bombing thing came, where they would fly low, drop a bomb out of their bay, and basically use the concussion from it to deter trailing aircraft. Now, this did have a little bit of defense from the beginning. If you look on the wings on this model here, you see these little kind of housings. Those were there from the beginning, and they housed a radar early warning system. But it seems like, I mean, these don't have it. A lot of them don't. So maybe it was removable. Probably was for maintenance, if nothing else. And later on, they would go to a more advanced system around 79, putting a RWR in the tail here. Got plenty of space, and so they could safely remove these ferrules. Although, interestingly, in the 80s, they would return for some aircraft because of other equipment being installed. They would also update the cockpit, the rear cockpit, when they went to the Martel missile, so the rear would have a TV screen, things of that nature. But overall, the airframes are holding up pretty darn well through the 70s. In 1978, these were at peak strength in the RAF with 5 active squadrons. And they really were starting to receive quite a few from the Navy. At one time, they possessed as many as 108 in the RAF. Like I said, in 79, they got the laser designator for the first time, so they could work with the paveway laser. They typically would be a designator for other aircraft. For example, the new Jaguar, later on the Harrier, heck, even other Buccaneers, and even later on, even planes like the Tornado, which weren't in service yet. But then in 1980, during an exercise, one of these crashed, and minor thing, the wing fell off. So obviously that spurred on another investigation, much as the S1 crash a decade earlier had. And they discovered that there was a metal fatigue. I mean, some of these aircraft had been flying for over a decade, and the ones that were ex-Navy, carrier takeoff and landings are brutal on airframes and people and everything, and decks. They're just brutal. So they grounded the entire fleet in 1980. And it looked like that might be the end of it. And it probably would have been, except for the Tornado, especially the F3 version, the air superiority version, continued to be delayed. So what they did, they looked at about the 90 or so serviceable airframes they had left. They picked 60 of them that were in good shape, updated some, refurbished a few that needed a little work, but they got 60 up and running to fly. And they'd basically have a few squadrons for maritime, and they started using these for ground attack. In 1983, the Tornado finally started to come online, at least the ground attack version, so this kind of took some things off, and the number of squadrons reduced to 3 for the Buccaneer. 2 maritime, which is their main duty, and they just kind of one standby ground attack squadron. But then in 86, the missiles, the anti-shipping missiles, bring it again, changed. The Martel, which was pretty bee's knees for the late 60s, was looking aged. Mainly its guidance system and the fact that it could only carry 2-3 maximum. They went to the new Seagull missile, which is honestly just a super update of the Martel. It went from a rocket engine to a jet engine, but more importantly, it was a fire and forget weapon, meaning that the aircraft did not have to accommodate an external pod to guide it. So, in theory, the Buccaneer could carry up to 4. Now, in practice, they would usually just carry 2, but they could carry 4. In fact, this is one of the major complaints with the Tornado when it would take over the Buccaneer's role. The Tornado really only could carry 2. So, Buccaneer had better capacity. Of course, the Tornado would run circles around it. Anyway, this was kind of the last major round of updates in 86, 87 with the new missiles. This is also when they would go from the AIM-9B and kind of interim AIM-9G to the AIM-9L Sidewinder, which was actually a capable missile. Of course, this wasn't for attack. This was just for defense. Again, the aircraft had no cannon, so without something, it's a sitting duck on land. But yeah, these continue to be used in NATO war games in the U.S. and Canada, and the Buccaneer acquitted itself very well. It's a low-level, fast strike thing and ability. The rotating bomb bay was actually quite advantageous. And with the new Sidewinder and just, simulated kills for war games, Buccaneers actually shot down a few other jets. Speaking of that, imagine getting... This was kind of nicknamed by the air crews the banana jet. The reason why is exceedingly British. It's not what you think. Although many that didn't like it called it the brick, which is honestly just not as attractive as Thud for the F-105, but I digress. It was one of those aircraft that a lot of people didn't care much about until they flew it, and then they ended up being diehard converts. Because it just was a good handler, and it was a very sturdy airframe. So, they're planning to pretty much draw down the remaining squadrons in 1990. And then Operation Desert Shield occurs. And then this evolves into Desert Storm, or Granby, for the British. And at first, they tell the COs of the Buccaneers, yeah, we probably won't need you. We can take care of it. But on January 26, 1991, the powers that be changed their mind. But they gave them plenty of time to, get ready, get everything together. They gave them all of 72 hours to get their asses to the Gulf. Kid you not. And not only did they get there around the 29th, 30th, they were in active combat helping laser designate for tornadoes by February 2nd. And during that month, they would fly over 200 missions. They would do a lot of laser designating, but they would also drop bombs themselves, including laser-guided bombs and just regular iron bombs. They would target roadways, especially bridges, and were very good at knocking out bridges. Their secondary targets were often air bases and supporting structures for those. And then third, they just kind of went for targets of opportunity. Trucks, tankers, APCs, deuce and a halves, whatever on the ground. And they had more than a few pretty big wallops. Originally, they sent 6 over. These were reinforced with 6 more. And typically, the flight would be 4 tornadoes at a time and 2 Buccaneers. And they sent 2 Buccaneers, so in case one of them had a mechanical issue or its laser system failed, the mission wouldn't have to be scrubbed, because without that pod, it was useless. It's worth pointing out that the laser systems of the time were not all-weather. They weren't nighttime capable, so these were daylight missions only. And this was the only time, at least in British service, that the Buccaneer dropped bombs in anger. Now, the South Africans, they used theirs, but yeah, we're talking about the British here. And in March of 1991, all 12 S.2Bs successfully went back home to England and quickly washed off their paint. It was pink. They were told it was brown, but it was pink. And from there, they really did start to be replaced by the Tornado. By this point, the F3 is finally online. The Jaguar is at full strength. The Harrier is coming up with the new version. Yeah. So by 1993, there's only one active squadron of Buccaneers left. Sorry. Didn't mean to hit you. Well, my camera. And they actually plan to keep them in service a bit longer, maybe to the end of the decade. But, again, post-war cutbacks, Cold War cutbacks, meant that the last Buccaneer squadron was stood down in March of 1994. But to be fair, I mean, all the aircraft were 20 years old and nearly so, some of them close to 30 at this point. So, it was time. And at least they did get one shot at combat. It looked like they might not. And they had a very good record. They didn't lose any of their people. And they hit their targets. So, moving into 95, the only Buccaneers flying in the UK were those three that were at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, in Farnborough. They still were using them for testing, but even they would retire theirs at the end of that year. And that's it. There are no airworthy Buccaneers in the UK today. In fact, the last airworthy ones were in South Africa. There are some museum displays, but that's about it. I think it's just a really cool aircraft. I love British design aesthetics. What do you think? So we end with them all lined up again. I do like this one because it's close to naval configuration. I mean, it was a naval Buccaneer at one time. It was just taken on by the RAF. And I think the fueling probe is kind of neat. They actually use these as ad hoc bomb sites too. So it said. And I do kind of like that it's got a clean look to it. Just very straightforward, very jet. And since it was a bomber with an internal bay, and before the missiles came along, this could have very well been how it would have launched off a carrier to save on weight. It's neat. I wish I knew more about this one, because there's just not a lot of story out there on it. Everywhere reports it not as an S.2B, but as just an S.2. Like I said, when I got it, the pylons were just empty. I just put a couple of little iron bombs on it. Can you guess where they're from? What aircraft? If so, I will be very impressed. Just having a little fun. But it's a neat one. This is actually the one I've had the longest. I've had this one for several years. Picked it up when they were newly in stock. But this one I just picked up this week because Aikens was doing kind of their year-end house cleaning, and they found some very interesting models in the back. And this was one of them. Like I said, this is number 2 in the series. So, it is pretty old. I wish they had number 1, the naval one. But I do like that it has the pod. Let me know, like I said, if this is an ECM pod or a laser designator. They also added chaff and flare pods to these at different times. But I really wanted one that had an AIM-9 Sidewinder on board, so cool. This is definitely my favorite out of all these. Yeah, maybe one day I'll find one of the 3 Navy issue ones. If I do, which one's the best? Let me know. But yeah, I just really like the Buccaneer, and there's not much out there on this aircraft. So I thought, nice quiet night, except for Hobo the cat meowing at the door. Let's talk some Buccaneers. So which one do you like? What's your favorite? The nice thing about Corgis, they're not priced so expensive that you can't afford to get several. They're about half the price in a lot of instances of Hobby Masters, or at least 2/3. So I don't really regret it. And they are very heavy-duty metal. They have a few faults, but that's not one of them. Alrighty, guys. I probably will keep doing some British aircraft, or just whatever I feel like on time to time. Appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and feel free to comment below. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.